This is the podcast that puts you at the pointy end of the airplane with two veteran airline captains. We'll offer insight into the pilot brain, we'll have some fun, and promise not to get too techy. Each weekly episode has a segment that provides inside information on what's really going on behind the cockpit door, and we'll discuss some industry current topics that might affect your travels. Your two pilots and co-hosts are Les Abend and Mike Strauss. Les has over 4 decades and over 25,000 hours of experience flying airplanes. The Boeing 727, 757, 767, and the 777 were all part of Les's repertoire before he retired. He was also a Czech airman. Additionally, Les still has the good fortune to be a 21-year contributing editor for Flying Magazine. He's been an on-air analyst and op-ed contributor for CNN, in addition to MSNBC and NBC, among others. And finally, Les is the author of Paper Wings, a mystery suspense whodunit thriller. Mike is a current A320 captain and Czech airman for a major airline with over 17,000 hours of flight time. In addition to his airline experience, Mike has a diverse general aviation background as an airplane salesman and a corporate pilot flying celebrities and VIPs. If you haven't done so already, please listen to the Welcome Aboard introductory episode. Don't get on an airplane until you've listened to Candid Cockpit.
Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Candid Cockpit. My name is Les Abend.
And my name is Mike Strauss.
And this week on the takeoff segment, we're going to discuss what's been in the news quite a bit. Matter of fact, last week, it was testimony in front of Congress by Southwest Airlines and that debacle, disaster, catastrophe of the travel cancellations, all the flight cancellations that were happening during the holiday from the 20th of December till the 29th. We'll talk about why did it happen and what's going to happen to possibly prevent that.
Right. So certainly you don't want to see it happen again, but weather can do some funny things. We'll get into that. And for the cruise segment, tilt your seat back and prepare for a candid discussion on what it's like being a co-pilot. From both a task standpoint and a philosophical standpoint. I mean, there's certain roles for each pilot, but there's a lot to talk about there.
There's a little bit of protocol and things of that nature, a little bit of nuance that we can talk about.
Right,
yeah. And then finally, for the landing segment, as per one of our listeners' requests, we're going to offer some interesting insight on how to save gas, how to save we call it fuel, but how we conserve fuel for the company. There's a lot of different ways that we can do it, and this particular listener was very attuned to that, and as we are with our own car gas prices.
Yeah,
so
you're very careful there. Hey, folks, one thing before we get going on our episode, we'd like to ask you to invite your friends to a Candid Cockpit podcast. Let everybody know. Maybe someone's got some questions or a suggested topic. Send us an email at podcast@candidcockpit.com. We'll mention your name on air. Don't forget to watch us on YouTube and then links on FaceTime, Facebook. all the normal social media platforms.
We're dating ourselves by not being able to label social media.
Hey, at least I didn't say MySpace.
Yeah, right.
But Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and your favorite podcast application.
Absolutely. And the other thing that we forget to mention is if you're going on an airplane flight, peek your head in the cockpit door with the flight attendant's permission, of course. Peek your head in the cockpit door and say, hey, I'm listening to Candid Cockpit. Right. You're going to get a puzzled look.
Right.
But
then they might ask you for, really, where can we find this?
Yeah, exactly. So, you can help us.
Yeah,
very
please.
good.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. We're going to start on our takeoff episode, and as we discussed, it's going to be about the Southwest debacle with that weather cancellation delay, 16,000 plus flights canceled.
Mother Nature had a field day.
Yeah, well,
it started it. She threw the ball onto the field.
And it was and it was quite the throw too. Yeah. So unfortunately, Southwest went through that whole debacle and cancellations as a result of all this big snowstorm that moved across the country. Their big cities are Chicago and Denver, and they were the most affected.
Right.
So the problem was that there was not only that, but because of a rise in COVID-19, regular flu, and we forgot about the RSV cases, a lot of employees called out sick.
Yeah.
So that made it even worse.
Not to mention, there is usually an uptick in sick calls, whether they're sick or not, over the holidays for employees that want to really spend time with their families but couldn't because of schedules or such like that. That plays a small portion of it, but it adds a little bit.
Yeah, but I think a lot of me as an employee, if I had to work on a holiday, I knew that if I called in sick,
you're going to get scrutinized.
Well, there's that, but you're kind of screwing your fellow employee because now they have to get called out. Granted, they're on reserve, potentially.
I agree with that, and I'm that same way. But and I'd like to think that most of the airline employees understand this industry as they get into it.
Yeah,
but there still might be a small percentage, and every little tiny bit. That's
but I think that would have been a small factor in this. But anyhow, we gave a little insight into some of our philosophical things. But the problem with Southwest, or the good thing about Southwest, the advantage is they have a business model that they fly to smaller cities. So
that's why they're successful.
That's why they're successful, and they do this thing called point to point as opposed to hub. So, that kind of added to the woes because, crews would pick up an airplane that came in from some other point, and if they misconnected because of the snowstorm, well, that crew's not there to take out the next flight, right?
Correct.
And then the other thing is the big thing that, that we as pilots relate to is that their crew schedule system is antiquated. They were calling in as opposed to electronically signing in and saying, hey, we're here. There are applications out there. My airline, when I retired, had that in place for quite a while, and they're still, to use, the term out, they're bitching about it still.
Yeah.
And it needs to be fixed. But we'll get into that a little bit, and just. But that notification system was antiquated. The switchboard was literally overloaded with crews saying, "Hey, I'm here."
And I've only been in this industry for 18 years. And we've had a fairly computerized system since I got here.
Right.
But I got to think back 10 years prior to that, before applications, before smartphones, maybe even before cell phones. How did crew services get a hold of crew and vice versa?
Well, it was, with me, my airline was much, much smaller.
Right.
When I got hired, my number was 4,098. When I retired, there was 15,000 pilots, not including a merger, but, that makes a huge difference.
It does.
It makes a huge difference. So, yeah.
Trying to find out where everybody is not an easy task.
It's not.
Continuing on, let's talk about the passenger compensation. I got to applaud Southwest. They stepped right up to the plate quickly.
Yeah.
With not much fanfare required from the public, and they took care of their passengers. They reimbursed them for their flights. They reimbursed them for any expenses, rental car, hotel, meals. 200 over almost 300,000 passengers were affected by this. So that's a pretty big check they had to write.
And bring up something. We just before we went on air with this podcast, you talked about your airline had a pretty terrible event that actually initiated a lot of.
Let me cover up my airplane right here.
Some government rules.
It did,
but the real big problem was the fact that the airline was very slow to react, and they learned their lesson, right? But Southwest, like you said, you got to give them credit.
So again, our debacle led to better rules, better protections for the passengers, and it also led to perhaps further airlines going, oh, we don't want to do that again, so let's jump on this real quick.
Yeah.
And it was tough for us, and the downside is what the weather can do is it can expose your weaknesses.
Yeah.
And not necessarily a weakness. It can just expose how fast time creeps along before you make changes that needed to be made.
Right.
And that's what happened with us. It cost our CEO his job.
Yeah.
But some good things came of it. The tarmac rule, Southwest or other airlines.
The tarmac rule, meaning there's only so much time that you can be trapped on an airplane before you have to get back to the gate,
right? Or
get
compensated
or like given water even,
right? And the incentive is the fines that the airline will incur.
Right, it's all about
quite
money
hefty.
sometimes. Yeah,
right.
But anyhow, do you want to talk about the what else Southwest did other than their reaction? And
so so not only with the passengers, but their employees. You got to think about that too. Just because the passengers are disrupted, well, the employees are disrupted. You touched on, they can't misconnect to the. If they misconnect to their next flight, they can't go anywhere, and that's a chain. It's a chain reaction.
Which means which equates to money. It's their pocketbook. If they're not flying that trip,
they're not getting paid for it.
They're not getting paid
right.
for it necessarily.
Now we have things called pay protection, which Southwest honored, but also Southwest took it a step farther with their employees, and they gave them an added bonus just for being part of this, and covered all their expenses, because some of them, if you can't get a hold of crew services and you're in a city you're not supposed to be in, well, guess what? You probably don't have a hotel you're supposed to be in.
Right.
So the crews had to take it upon themselves to get hotels and meals, and not just for, so it's the captain's responsibility to look out for his entire crew.
Right.
So, and maybe some flight attendants, don't have the ability to buy what may be a $300 or $400 hotel room for that night,
right,
or several nights. So the captain's job there again is to look out after his crew, and the airline was great in reimbursing everybody without question.
And then getting back to passengers, same kind of thing. They reimbursed them for hotels. They reimbursed them for rentals, and for meals, and they were credited back a ticket. They were given a ticket refund, and then they were given 25,000 frequent flyer miles as well, which doesn't sound like a whole heck of a lot, but
it's a round trip on Southwest.
Yeah,
it adds up.
It adds up, and so you got to give the airline credit for it. Listen, this whole thing, it was an $800,000, $800 million.
Add a couple zeros.
Yeah, it's some zeros. Lost to the airline in that last quarter of the year.
Yeah.
So now this first quarter, they're still anticipating that's going to carry through as part of the loss. And if you remember about Southwest, for all the years that airlines were up and down, going through bankruptcy, Southwest, 47 years, always had a profit.
Yeah.
Always had a
Speaks
profit.
Volumes for how they operated their airline.
Yeah.
And they have always been a great airline. They've been a great destination airline for crew members, employees. People have always wanted to work there. They've always been one of the top places to work for.
Right.
Passengers love them. It's kind of, maybe passengers have always loved them because they've always treated people very well. And
it's got a different atmosphere than most. My airline could be stodgy and, very sort of regimented in some people's definition. But where Southwest was sort of an offshoot from the standpoint that they were more relaxed. They did all the safety things, but
of course,
it was fun to
it was fun to fly on them. It was fun to fly for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, a great airline, but they got affected. They just kind of got, I'm not going to say complacent. They just hadn't quite kept up with the times.
Yeah. And the pilots were big on the fact that the infrastructure, the applications, for crews to sign into crew scheduling, to crew tracking, however they do it, it's antiquated, and it's from the 90s. And there's a difference between 90s and now. I mean,
even 90s to the 2000s and the 2000s to the 10s to the 20s.
It's my iPhone, from 2 years ago is different. We know that. So, yeah, all of that stuff combined, to make a disaster. So what they have done in some spots is the airports that were most effective, they realized they needed better equipment, especially like snowstorm type equipment. So they are going to manage it better. And then their management structure is another thing that they're going to address, notwithstanding what we've been talking about with the crew scheduling issues.
Just kind of restructuring in how managers do their job a little bit and more efficient. And of course, the biggest thing is update their computer system.
Well, yeah, with the software that gets these crews electronically signed in and whatever it is, whatever app they need to upgrade to, and they've already been doing that. They've run tests on it, and so it's in progress. I don't know what the success is at this point.
I'm sure it's in its infancy, but again, the fact that they got on this so fast. I mean, that That says again a lot about the airline and how they want to treat their employees and their passengers. That we need to fix this. We're not going to talk about fixing it in somewhere a couple of years down the road. We're going to fix it now.
Yeah, and I think that they drifted away from that philosophy for a little bit, and I think that's why a lot of the pilots are sort of upset,
Right.
About that. But a reflection of the fact that people see that there will be improvements is that my understanding is that about 25%. Of the people that were canceled during that holiday disaster are
Already
rebooking.
booking. Yeah,
rebooking.
they're ready to go fly with them again. They're willing to give them that second chance.
Yeah.
And that again, it's good. It's trust for the airline. It's trust for what everybody does to make an airline run smoothly, which, as we all know, is no easy task.
And the other aspect is that, Southwest had a different business model where, we said that they fly into smaller cities. So for instance, they fly into Midway, Chicago Midway, right? And Dallas Love Field, which is a smaller, less intimidating airport for people. They serve, smaller communities in some circumstances. And, it's the point-to-point business model that seems to attract people. On those flights. So.
It makes it easy to travel on them, but it makes it a little more difficult to run that operation because, like you said earlier, if something happens in one city and it's a smaller city where they don't have a crew base or a lot of support, it makes it hard to get crews and support to that place, to that city.
Right, exactly.
Every airline has a bad day, maybe a bad week,
bad
couple of days.
I know we were in the news a lot, when I was there. So yeah, it's. You know what? At the end of the day, it is a safe airline. It's an airline that's got a good business model, and it'll recover. As a matter of fact, it's being so well scrutinized, just like airplanes that have trouble.
Right.
It's being so well scrutinized that I think it's going to be one of the best airlines to travel on.
Probably, at least. Yeah. No, agreed.
For where, if it's going where you want it to go, of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good point.
Anything else?
No. Kudos to Southwest for what they did.
Yeah.
But they took a bad situation and made it as good as possible.
Kudos to how they reacted.
How they reacted. You're right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah. Moving on to our cruise segment. This will be a pretty short conversation for me. My experience and philosophy as a first officer, a co-pilot. I did it in an airline environment for less than a year. You?
Me? Well, mine was very short compared to what the industry had been before, but it was only 5 years.
Okay.
And now we're seeing about what you experienced, which is highly unusual. But I retired with co-pilots. Now, granted, they like life sitting on
Quality
a wide body airplane,
right,
going to Europe and all other places. But I had some co-pilots 25 years sitting in that right seat.
Well, we had a conversation with a friend of ours just the other night who's recently retired United Airlines pilot, sat as a co-pilot for 17 years.
Yeah.
And
sometimes it's your choice, and sometimes it's all a matter of luck of the draw and your seniority.
Correct. Yeah. And what the industry is doing at that time,
right?
During that time frame. I got hired with my airline a little over 4 years after they went into business. So we were still going through a pretty quick growth spurt, which allowed for me to upgrade fast. But it also made for the hiring requirements to be a little bit higher than normal because knowing that you were going to be a captain very quickly.
Right.
And
we talked about that on another episode.
Yeah, and sitting co-pilot, it makes you a good captain because now you're flying with a lot of different captains, so you can take all of these techniques and learn from them, good and bad. And I feel that I missed some of that. I think I turned out to be a good captain. I haven't had too many people complain about me, and I still have a job.
Well, have you looked on the bathroom walls? Is your name up there?
Well, I don't go to the public bathrooms in the crew lounge.
Gotcha.
But they're, and I still learn as a captain now. I mean, 17 years later, I've been sitting as a captain. I sat for a first officer, like I said, as just less than a year. And I still learn, and I watch my first officers because that helps me to learn. But it's an interesting position. It's where you first go when you become an airline pilot. So you are a co-pilot. I know some of us call it first officer. Some airlines refer to it as co-pilot. That just could be a generational thing as well. But you're busy as a first officer. You get to learn a lot because you're doing a lot. You really are. Granted, we all have our responsibilities, and technically it's a shared cockpit, and it's shared responsibilities. Obviously, with the ultimate responsibility falling on the captain, but as a first officer, you're doing a lot of work.
Yeah.
And to be a good first officer, my idea of being a first officer was having something ready for my captain before he asked me for it.
Right.
And that's where CRM, crew resource management, comes into play.
And it starts in operations.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, getting the flight plan. There's various ways of making that happen. So yeah, I agree with you. It's the one thing that you become very good at. Although I'll argue that point with some people is diplomacy. Is that I found that I exercised more diplomacy as a captain because I tried to treat things with honey before I did it with salt. But as a co-pilot especially, if you see the old guy doing something that might be questionable or he missed something, that's why there's two of us up there, and you don't want to say, "Hey, idiot." He said turn right to heading such and such, and you're not on that. You can be a little more diplomatic. You have to be a little bit more diplomatic.
And that goes two ways. I mean, in old school days, back when you learned to fly with the rights, I think the captain's role was a little different. He might turn to you and say, "Hey, you see that right wingtip? Everything this side of it's mine," kind of thing. But that's, again, where crew resource management was born of that. So co-pilots aren't afraid to not necessarily call out a captain, but say to him, "Hey, are we sure we heard this right? Let's confirm," or something like that. And a good captain, which is born from being a good first officer, would say, "Hey, that's a great idea. Let's look at this together."
I didn't just start in the airline. Obviously, I flew for other operations before there, but I had the ability. I had the good fortune or the bad fortune of flying with captains that I didn't epitomize because they weren't great people to be with. And there were things that they did that I didn't quite like. So, but then you flew with captains that were great, and you picked and choose what are good attributes of these captains and brought that with you. I mean, when I got to the airline, I had an experience with one captain that was just horrific. And he was just the epitome of somebody you don't want to be around.
Right.
And by the time the trip was over, after 3 days, I just literally walked out of the cockpit and I said some things I probably shouldn't have to him. And I got home thinking, I'm going to be fired.
For this, yeah.
Yeah, because I was still on probation.
Nowadays they do a lot of hiring. I mean, if you get to an airline interview board, chances are they know you're a pilot, they know you can fly the airplane. Part of the interview process, which is about your flying skills, your flying experience, but it's also, do I want to spend 4 days in an airplane with you?
Right.
Right. And can you commingle? Can everybody get along well? And it's necessary, especially if a situation comes up.
Absolutely.
That you need both of you there at the top of your game.
And I think, and it's an important point because I think that is part of the hiring process. I think that when you have folks that are doing the recruiting, the hiring, these pilots are thinking exactly what you said. Do I want to spend time? Yeah, I know this individual is qualified, but do I want to spend time with this individual in the cockpit? Is this person going to be an asset to my cockpit?
Right. It makes me think of something. Just because you're a first officer doesn't mean you haven't been a captain before.
Right.
And that can be tough. You fly with. I've flown with first officers that are still trying to be a captain. Let's say their previous airline. Let's say maybe they come for a regional. Standard progressions is coming from a regional.
You had U.S. Air people come to your airline, right? That had been
many.
Yeah, that had been dissatisfied with the airline, that just got laid off,
furloughed, and they came, and now they're first officer. They've been captains at this other airline at U.S. Air, and then they're now sitting as first officer. And it's difficult to take that captain hat off to then be a first officer,
right?
Again, but if you can do it, and I think a lot of guys can, because you've got to live that professionalism, and they're able to realize, okay, this is where I'm at right now. Now I'm going to learn things about this airline for when I move over to the left seat. I've had there was one guy who was captain at a regional express airline, and I had to take PA privileges away from him one time as he vented his frustration with the things that were taking place on the ramp. But, most everybody I've flown with that's come from that position into now a first officer position, it's been a pleasure, and I can learn from them because they might have been a captain longer than I was.
True.
And so now I can learn.
I look at it's good to look at it the same exact way. So as we typically ask, we want to invite your friends, your family, your dog to promote Candid Cockpit. Please have them listen. I don't know. The dogs might like it.
I'm going to get my dog a bandana with Candid Cockpit on it.
There you go. And the other part of it is, so we know that you're listening and then you're interested, send us an email and at podcast@candidcockpit.com. And with your permission, we'll mention your name on air. And then please watch us on YouTube. And don't forget, before you get on your flight, poke your head in the cockpit with the permission of the flight attendant once again and say, hey, I'm listening to Candid Cockpit. Yeah. See what kind of reaction you get. All right. Thank you very much for that.
Okay, as we move to our landing segment, how can the pilot help the airline conserve fuel? Well, it's pretty easy. We have control of the gas lever, the thrust levers. I mean, this is where it comes. But we can. So weight requires extra fuel. I think the math is for every 1,000 pounds of extra fuel you carry, or every 1,000 pounds of whatever you carry costs an extra 100 pounds of fuel. That might be a little high, but I think it's a.
I'm not even going to go there with that. So,
we have to carry enough fuel. There are certain FAR requirements, Federal Aviation Regulation requirements, that we carry enough fuel to get to our destination.
That always helps. That's good. People like that.
Same day service helps too, because without having to make the fuel stops, and we don't really have the NASCAR pit stop down to science. So enough fuel to get to your destination with some extra to fly around just in case something might be taking place at the airport, maybe a little bit of extra weather, maybe a little bit of reroute for weather en route, closed airspace. Anyway, all these contingencies. And then if you are going to someplace where, let's say, there might be a little bit of weather, then you've got to have enough fuel to carry to your alternate airport.
And there are requirements for alternate airports, but you've got to have at least that amount of fuel on.
Right, at the very least. Now, you might be taking even more fuel because let's say you're going to a destination where there could be a shortage of fuel, which has happened of recent.
Right.
There could be, maybe the fuel is that much more expensive than where you are getting your fuel from.
Right.
And that happens at a lot of, let's say, outstations.
And usually that's a dispatch function because we're not necessarily privy to the price of that fuel.
Exactly. Yeah. And fuel is not cheap. Right now, I know for a fact we're paying $3 at the amount of fuel we buy, which, by the way, is the airline's greatest expense.
Right.
We pay $3.70 a gallon.
Yeah.
And we don't want to talk about how many gallons an hour we burn. But again, another reason to tanker fuel.
And tankering fuel can, like you said, it's the more weight you put on the airplane, tankering fuel adds the weight, and therefore to get the airplane airborne, it costs more. It's more energy, and less energy is fuel.
And someone's doing that math. Okay, if we carry extra fuel, does it make up for the extra fuel we have to burn?
Right.
Based on what the fuel is.
Right. It's a complicated formula. But let's talk more about what we as pilots. Well, we've already sort of touched on one of them. It's like just like in your car, if you got a lead foot,
you're going to burn more gas.
You're going to burn more gas.
The good news is most airplanes have an auto throttle system and a sophisticated autopilot system that don't allow us to make. Well, we can always override that.
Yeah, of course.
But it runs as efficient as possible.
Right.
Which we'll get to that in a second, that efficiency, which is called a cost index. Right. But just simple things. If you know you're going to have a long taxi to the runway, it's a busy time of the day, taxi out on one engine.
Right.
There's, at least in my light twin, there are 3 jet engines, 2 that make the airplane go, and 1 that gets the other 2 engines started to make the airplane go.
Right.
And the APU, auxiliary power unit, which burns jet fuel at a more efficient rate than, let's say, one of the engines, but it's used for air conditioning and electric systems throughout the aircraft. So you taxi out with 1 engine and the APU. You're still saving gas by going out on 1 engine. Same thing coming in. after the engines cool down, 2 minutes on our airplane, you shut down one of the engines, taxi on one. And the amount of fuel you can save throughout a year is huge.
Yeah.
It is important.
And our airline was always on a big campaign to shut down the APU, and as long as environmentally it wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold, we'd plug in electrical power
at the gate.
At the gate,
Yeah.
So you didn't have to run the APU and thus consume fuel.
Yep, and we do exactly the same thing.
Because an auxiliary power unit, an APU on some airplanes like the 777 is almost as big a motor as
Go
around
ahead,
some
say it.
corporate.
Go ahead, say it.
No, on corporate airplanes, not as big as an A320.
On my light twin that I fly.
On light twin, yeah. So, but that's a way to do it. And then of course on the taxiway, a lot of times they have a stop on departures, or not a lot of times, but when they do have stop on departures. Or some sort of delay, and you're in a long line that you're not going to move anywhere, you shut
down the engines,
and then you leave the
APU running.
You leave the APU running.
Burns a lot less gas.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah,
well, more conservative cruise speed sometimes will help.
We have normal cruise, long range cruise, and high speed cruise.
Right.
Right. So if you're really trying to save some gas, maybe a little bit of extra headwind you're encountering more than forecast. And you're kind of doing some math, going, maybe if I slow down a little bit, I'll burn less fuel.
Right.
And even though it's going to take me longer, I'll still end up with more fuel when I land.
As long as you arrive there at your destination at the scheduled time of arrival, that's important. And then the other one is that I used a lot in London. Matter of fact, I required you to do it. It was what they call a planned continuous descent approach, so that the goal was that once they cleared you and started vectoring you for the approach via an arrival route, actually, you pulled the power back all the way to idle.
And pretty much didn't touch it till you got
to 1,000 feet.
Yeah,
that was the objective.
A few miles within the runway.
And it was easy to accomplish. London is known for, setting up their structure very, very well, and they really stick to it. But you can actually calculate where you should be at what altitude, and it worked most of the time. It really did.
A lot more stars or standard arrival routes into local airport, U.S. airports now are playing that
Right.
same game, and it's making a difference. They've restructured how the routes are to make them more streamlined.
Yep.
And again, top of descent, they'll just bring you right from the top, and they'll give you a clearance from the top all the way down to the lowest altitude on that arrival, and that can be you can start at 37,000 feet, get to 5,000 feet. And that's the one clearance all the way down. And you do. The airplane, with the sophisticated computers in the airplane, it knows, okay, if we start that descent here, we can pull the power to idle, and you won't touch it again until you get there. And that's a huge savings in fuel.
It is. I mean, in the 727 that did not have, at least with our airline, did not have auto throttles. I remember that it was always sort of competitive among us up, flying the airplane. Is like, when did you touch that power lever? Did it make it to 1,000 feet that you had to push the power lever up? Yeah. And then we're not a glider by any means, but the airplane has a good glide ratio. But when we add the power, we're adding the power because we've got the gear down. The flaps down. So now we
reconfigured the airplane.
We have to reconfigure the airplane, and it needs power to get on the ground. So we're not landing with the power off.
Right. No, definitely not.
No,
it's definitely spooled up.
Yeah, we ruin people's dentures if we do that kind of thing. So,
right.
So the one thing, Mike, is we had one of our listeners send us an email, and his name is Mike Corder. And he is one of those airline type pilot wannabes. He was considering a career, and he actually took 32 hours of lessons. And he's he'll readily admit he's geeky in the sense that he decided that because life got in the way and he couldn't afford to continue and aspire to be an airline pilot. He went on and did other things, and it sounds like he's successful in that. But he's got a home simulator, and you know how sophisticated those can be.
Mind-bogglingly so.
They're amazing. And I went to a convention once with these folks, and a friend of mine has one of those home simulators, and I was very impressed with all the people. They were professional. They enjoyed it. They were passionate about it. But that's what he's doing. So he's flying a simulator, and so he gets into the nitty-gritty, the details, and he gets into this thing, and I promise I won't get techie on this, but it's It's called cost index, and the cost index is a number that goes into our flight management system, into our computers,
Right.
and cost index, depending on the flight, is what decides what the throttles are going to be at, our power levers, where they're going to be fuel wise. Do we need to conserve fuel on this flight and we're good on our arrival time, or do we need to
Power it up a little bit.
and get our people to
They're
their
on
destination on time? So there were incremental numbers that we could use, and then there were standard numbers. But the bottom line is, without getting into all sorts of techie stuff, it was a number that the computer utilized to determine what we were going to do for fuel conservation.
Yeah. It's figuring out the best fuel economy for the flight you're taking.
Right.
Winds, altitudes, temperatures, times. It's all these things going into one thing.
Right, and then great point. It brought in all of those other environmental factors and so on and so forth. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, since it's been a while, but we could put in any number from 0, I think, to 100.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it all depended upon, depending upon the number, depended upon what your fuel consumption.
We run 35 usually.
Yeah, and that was about what we did, 30 or 35.
Yeah, I think that seems to be a popular number. And then if you need to pump it up a little bit, 40, 45, 50.
We already got techie.
Yeah, techie. Sorry, my bad.
So, but anyhow,
look at that. It says, don't get too techie. Sorry, folks.
But anyhow,
it's a habit.
Thank you to our listener for bringing that to our attention. And there you go.
So we've landed, and we're taxiing to the gate. And as we get our brakes set at the gate, I can see the agent moving the jet bridge towards us. Fortunately, anyway, we hope our listeners did gain some insight, and again, hitting topics that people are asking us about. Anyway, insight in the pilot brain without getting too techie, and the airline world. We appreciate you joining us. Next episode, we're going to discuss, we talked about what it's like to be a first officer. Now we're going to talk about what it's like to be a captain, to be in charge. I mean, the ultimate responsibility is with you.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of people back there.
Yep. And then we'd like you to spread the word. As we mentioned before, please, family, friends. We did mention dogs. I don't know how effective that's going to be.
Yeah, I'm going to order the bandana for my dog.
But podcast at candidcockpit.com. And then please watch us on your favorite app for podcasts, and YouTube. We're available on YouTube. You can see us make fools of ourselves, and then follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
Yeah, keep bringing us those subjects. As we get into this, we look for more subjects. We've got some, but we'd like to hear more from you. What you really want to hear.
Absolutely.
Anyway. That's all I got.
Don't get on an airplane until you've listened to Candid Cockpit. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for joining us today.